Britain didn't lose control suddenly. It loosened its grip without noticing, not because authority disappeared, but because it had to travel too far to matter. Orders left London with confidence. They crossed an ocean. And by the time they arrived, the situation they were meant to control had already changed. This war was never only about rebellion. It was about distance, and what distance quietly does to power. The American colonies did not look dangerous from Britain. For more than a century, they had been managed, taxed, supplied, and governed from afar. The system was imperfect, but it worked well enough. Ships carried instructions, officials enforced policy, and colonial assemblies operated within limits that London believed it controlled. The empire had learned to function slowly, and it mistook slowness for stability. From the British perspective, America was not a single place. It was a collection of ports, farms, towns, and legislatures scattered along a distant coast. That distance mattered less when loyalty was assumed. Problems could be postponed, disputes could be delayed, authority did not need to be present every day, only remembered. This created a dangerous confidence. Britain believed it had time to respond, time to adjust, time to enforce decisions once tempers cooled. But time behaves differently when it must cross an ocean. A message sent from London took weeks to arrive. A response took weeks more. Decisions were always late, and consequences always arrived first. In London, the empire still felt solid. Trade continued. Taxes were debated. Laws were passed with the assumption that they would eventually be obeyed. The distance between decision and reaction made resistance feel abstract. Colonial anger appeared manageable precisely because it was slow to report back. But in America, the situation felt very different. Local pressure built quickly. Assemblies argued, crowds gathered, and enforcement fell to officials who lived among the people they were meant to control. British authority was present in name, but often absent in force. By the time instructions arrived, the moment they were meant to address had already passed. Britain did not recognize this as weakness. It saw it as inconvenience, a temporary irritation that firm policy would correct. The assumption was simple. Once authority reasserted itself, order would return. The empire had survived unrest before. It would survive this as well. What Britain did not yet understand was that distance had changed the balance. Control that depended on delay was no longer control. It was hope, and hope is not a strategy. The war had not yet begun in full, but the conditions for it were already set. Britain believed it governed America. In reality, it was reacting to it. And the farther events drifted from London's immediate reach, the less Britain could shape them. By the time force became the answer, authority had already thinned. And once power must travel that far to be felt, it arrives weaker than intended. The problem was no longer rebellion. It was reach. From London, this was never meant to become a war of consequence. British leadership did not imagine America as a battlefield that could absorb attention for years. The assumption was that resistance would be brief, fragmented, and ultimately self-defeating. The colonies depended on Britain economically. Their population was scattered. Their political unity was uncertain. Against the world's most experienced imperial power, sustained defiance seemed unlikely. So the conflict was framed narrowly: limited force, controlled pressure, a demonstration of authority rather than a campaign of transformation. Britain did not prepare for a long war because it did not believe one was possible. This assumption shaped every early decision. Troops were deployed not to conquer territory, but to restore order. Generals were instructed to protect loyalty rather than destroy resistance. The goal was compliance, not annihilation. Britain was not fighting a foreign enemy. It believed it was disciplining its own system. That belief mattered. Because when a war is expected to be small, patience replaces urgency. Planning favors restraint. Resources are allocated cautiously. Britain did not mobilize as if its position was at risk. It acted as if time was on its side. But small wars require quick resolution. And quick resolution requires proximity. In America, British forces were isolated pockets of authority, operating in a vast landscape they did not control. Cities could be occupied, but countryside could not. Supply lines stretched thin. Intelligence was unreliable. Loyalist support was inconsistent and often overstated. Britain assumed loyalty existed because it needed it to. Each delay compounded the problem. Reinforcements took months to arrive. Instructions lagged behind events. Commanders in the field were forced to improvise while still bound by expectations set in London. When they acted decisively, they risked political backlash. When they acted cautiously, they lost momentum. The war refused to stay within its intended boundaries. Resistance did not collapse. It adapted. British pressure did not restore authority. It hardened opposition, and the longer the conflict continued, the less it resembled the controlled correction Britain had envisioned. Still, this was not yet recognized as failure. In London, setbacks were interpreted as temporary. Another shipment of troops, another directive, another attempt to reassert order. The assumption remained unchanged. Once the correct pressure was applied, the system would realign. But systems under strain do not always return to their original shape. Britain had designed its response for a short disturbance, not a prolonged struggle across an ocean. And as weeks became months and months became years, the cost of that miscalculation quietly grew. This was no longer a war meant to be small. It was becoming something Britain had not planned for and could not easily control. At first, distance was merely inconvenient. Then it became expensive. Then it became decisive. Every imperial system depends on movement of orders, supplies, reinforcements, and trust. In America, each of those moved slowly and none moved cleanly. What had once felt like manageable delay began to harden into structural pressure. British commanders in the field were fighting two wars at once, one against the resistance in front of them, another against time itself. They were expected to act decisively while waiting for guidance that arrived weeks too late. By the time approval came, the situation on the ground had already shifted. Decisions were always retrospective. Control lagged behind reality. Supply lines stretched across an ocean that did not care about urgency. Weather disrupted schedules. Ships were lost. Stores arrived incomplete or spoiled. Armies could win engagements, yet find themselves unable to exploit them. Victory required momentum. Distance drained it away. Communication made the problem worse. Reports sent to London were filtered by uncertainty and optimism. Commanders emphasized successes and softened setbacks, knowing their words would shape policy months later. In London, strategy was built on information that was already outdated. Plans were drawn for conditions that no longer existed. This created a dangerous cycle. London believed progress was being made. Field commanders felt increasing pressure to deliver results that the system could no longer produce. Each side acted on assumptions the other could not fulfill. Local conditions compounded the strain. America was not a compact theater of war. It was vast, uneven, and politically fragmented. British forces could occupy cities, but authority dissolved beyond the roads they controlled. Holding ground required manpower. Britain did not fully commit, because the war was still expected to resolve itself. Distance also affected loyalty. Those who might have remained neutral were forced to choose sides as the war dragged on. British authority felt distant and abstract. Local power felt immediate. Every delay in enforcement weakened Britain's presence and strengthened alternatives to it. None of this appeared dramatic in isolation. There was no single moment of collapse, just accumulation. Delays stacked on delays. Costs mounted quietly. Confidence thinned. From London, the war still looked manageable. From America, it felt increasingly unwinnable in the way Britain had imagined, not because the empire lacked strength, but because strength could not be applied precisely enough, quickly enough, or consistently enough. Distance had transformed from a geographic fact into strategic pressure. It distorted timing. It diluted authority. It turned power into reaction. Britain was no longer shaping events. It was responding to them, always one step behind. And once power is forced into reaction, it begins to reveal its limits. Britain continued to win battles. That was the problem. Military success no longer translated into control. Cities could be taken, ports occupied, armies dispersed, yet nothing stayed settled. Each victory felt temporary, each occupation fragile. Authority returned only where soldiers stood, and vanished the moment they moved on. This exposed a deeper issue. Britain was fighting a war that required permanence, with a system built for movement. Imperial power had always relied on flexibility, ships, trade routes, rotating garrisons. America demanded something else. It demanded sustained presence across vast space, among a population that no longer accepted distant rule. Commanders in the field sensed this shift before London did. They could defeat organized resistance and still lose influence. The countryside remained contested. Local institutions adapted. British authority felt episodic rather than continuous. Control flickered instead of holding. The war's logic began to invert. Victory did not reduce resistance, it redistributed it. Pressure applied in one region displaced it to another. Britain found itself chasing stability rather than establishing it. Each success generated new friction. In London, this was difficult to accept. The empire had been built on the assumption that military superiority guaranteed political outcomes. America challenged that assumption. The cost of enforcing authority grew disproportionate to its returns. More troops were required to hold the same ground. More resources to maintain diminishing leverage. Distance amplified every inefficiency. Replacements arrived late. Coordination suffered. Strategic unity fractured as commanders interpreted vague instructions differently. Britain's advantage in organization became a liability when coordination lagged behind events. At the same time, time itself began to work against Britain. Prolonged conflict strained finances, attention, and political will. The war became harder to justify at home. What had once been framed as restoring order now looked like sustaining an endless commitment. Yet Britain did not collapse. It adapted just enough to survive. That adaptation, however, came at a cost. The war was no longer about asserting control. It was about managing erosion. Preventing total loss replaced achieving decisive outcome. Control was slipping, not because Britain was weak, but because its methods were mismatched to the reality it faced. Power that cannot be applied continuously becomes symbolic. Authority that arrives late becomes negotiable. The empire still stood, but its grip was no longer secure, and once control begins to slip, distance stops being a challenge and becomes a verdict. Up to this point, Britain could still tell itself a familiar story. That this was an internal problem, a distant rebellion that would eventually exhaust itself. That illusion did not survive contact with the wider world. The moment other powers entered the conflict, the war stopped being manageable. What had already stretched Britain's reach now began to pull it apart. The American struggle was no longer confined to one coastline. It became part of a global contest Britain could not ignore. France's involvement changed the equation completely. Not because Britain was unprepared for war with France, but because it was already committed elsewhere. Resources that might have stabilized America now had to be divided. Attention fractured. Priorities blurred. The empire was forced to think globally while reacting locally. This was the critical pressure point. Britain had built its power on the ability to fight across the world, but that ability depended on choosing where pressure mattered most. America disrupted that choice. It demanded sustained focus at the exact moment Britain needed flexibility. Naval strength, once a stabilizing advantage, became a constant obligation. Trade routes had to be protected, other colonies had to be defended, European waters could not be neglected. America was no longer one front. It was a drain on every front. Distance multiplied the strain. Decisions that once required careful balance now required compromise. Reinforcing America weakened defenses elsewhere. Pulling back invited escalation. Britain was no longer shaping the war's boundaries. The war was shaping Britain's priorities. And still, the empire did not collapse. It absorbed the pressure. But absorption is not control. Each adjustment revealed how thinly power was spread. The war forced Britain to confront a truth it had avoided. Its strength was real, but not infinite. America had become more than a rebellion. It was a test of endurance, of coordination, of whether an empire could impose outcomes across an ocean while defending itself everywhere else. At this stage, the outcome was no longer about victory in the traditional sense. It was about limits. How far power could stretch before it began to distort. How many commitments could be sustained before none could be resolved cleanly. Britain was still standing, but it was no longer choosing the shape of the conflict. The war had expanded beyond Britain's control, and now beyond Britain's design. By the final years of the war, Britain was no longer trying to impose its will, it was trying to contain the outcome. This distinction mattered, because survival and victory are not the same thing. Britain still possessed power, naval, economic, and military. But the kind of power required to decisively resolve the conflict in America had slipped out of reach. The war had become too costly to escalate and too entangled to abandon abruptly. Britain was forced into a posture of management rather than dominance. Losses were weighed against consequences elsewhere. Every decision carried opportunity costs that extended far beyond the American coast. Negotiation replaced enforcement, not because Britain had been defeated in the field, but because the price of continuing exceeded the value of control. Authority that must be constantly reinforced ceases to be authority. It becomes obligation. This was the quiet end of the war's original purpose. Britain did not fall. It adjusted. It accepted limits it had previously denied. The empire remained vast, but it emerged altered. America was no longer a problem to be corrected. It was a reality to be acknowledged. This acceptance did not come easily. It represented more than territorial loss. It marked the recognition that distance had finally overridden control, that there were places power could reach and places it could not hold without unacceptable cost. The war concluded not with triumph or collapse, but with recalibration. Britain chose survival over assertion, stability over insistence. This choice preserved the empire, but it also confirmed something irreversible. The war had proven that imperial power was conditional, dependent on timing, coordination, and proximity. When those failed, strength alone was insufficient. Britain endured. But it did not prevail in the way it intended. And once power accepts survival instead of victory, it has already learned its limits. The American War of Independence did not destroy Britain. That is often misunderstood. The empire remained powerful. Its navy still ruled the seas. Its economy continued to grow. Its influence across the world did not vanish. If measured only by survival, Britain endured the war intact. But survival was not the revelation. Exposure was. What this war revealed, quietly, unmistakably, was that British power had conditions. It depended on proximity, on timing. on the ability to translate decisions into action before circumstances changed. In America, those conditions failed. Distance was not simply an obstacle, it was a filter. It weakened authority as it traveled. It delayed correction. It allowed local realities to harden before imperial response could arrive. By the time power was felt, it was already negotiating with outcomes rather than shaping them. This was not a lesson limited to America. It applied to any place where control relied on oceans, intermediaries, and time. The war exposed the difference between influence and command, between presence and projection. Britain adjusted accordingly. Future imperial strategy became more cautious, more selective. The empire learned to prioritize, to consolidate, to accept that not every possession could be managed in the same way. Expansion did not stop, but it changed character. America had shown what happened when distance outpaced authority. The uncomfortable truth is this: Britain did not lose because it lacked strength. It lost because strength arrived too slowly to matter. Power that cannot act in time becomes symbolic. Authority that cannot enforce itself becomes negotiable. This war marked the moment Britain encountered the outer edge of its own system. Not a collapse, but a boundary, one that could not be crossed without distortion. The empire survived, but the illusion of effortless control did not. And once that illusion is gone, power is never quite the same again.